May of the year 70 AD. Jerusalem awakens surrounded by 4 Roman legions. 60,000 armed men block every road, every path, every water source that fed the holiest city in the ancient world. The walls that protected entire generations now function in reverse. They don't keep enemies out. They trap 1 million people inside. The city that was the beating heart of Judaism transforms into a stone trap under the relentless Judean sun, and in the streets, among pilgrims who came for Passover. And will never leave again. A terrible realization begins to spread. This time there will be no negotiation. But the siege of Jerusalem did not begin in May of 1770. It began 4 years earlier, when the Jewish revolt against Rome erupted into open violence. What seemed like a local rebellion against abusive taxes quickly transformed into something much larger, a war of independence, a desperate attempt to expel the world's greatest empire from a land that, for the Jews, did not belong to Caesar. It belonged to God, and Rome did not tolerate challenges, not in a strategic province connecting Egypt to Syria, not at a time when the empire itself was convulsing with civil wars after Nero's death. This is a documentary about how a 4-month siege destroyed not only stones and walls, but completely dismantled the structure that kept an entire civilization functioning. How the fall of a city erased the religious, political, and identity center of a people, and how this destruction forced such a profound transformation that its effects spanned millennia. Because what Rome destroys in Jerusalem is not just a temple, it is the operating system of a culture. When General Titus, son of the new Emperor Vespasian, positions his legions around Jerusalem in April of 77 AD, the city is already divided. 3 rival Jewish factions control different neighborhoods. They fight each other with the same ferocity with which they would have fought against Rome. They burn each other's grain, stores. They execute rivals in the streets. The unity that could save Jerusalem disintegrates into civil war as the legions set up camps and build siege engines, and the common people, caught between factions and legions, begin to understand that there is no way out. Titus's first target is the outer wall, the city's newest line of defense. The legions build wooden siege towers covered with iron plates, mobile structures over 20 meters high that slowly approach the walls while catapults hurl 40-kilogram stones against the fortifications. Within 15 days, the outer wall falls. The Romans advance, but they encounter a second wall, and behind it, a third. Jerusalem was built over centuries to withstand precisely this. Each Roman conquest reveals a new line of defense, and each meter gained costs blood. But the real enemy is not the legions. It is time. With the city completely surrounded, nothing gets in. Not food, not clean water, not medical supplies. And inside the walls, there are far more people than Jerusalem was ever designed to hold. Pilgrims who came from all over Judea for Passover were trapped when the siege began. Refugees from smaller cities already conquered by Rome fled to Jerusalem months before. The population quadrupled, and the food stocks, already damaged by the internal civil war, began to disappear within weeks. Hunger arrives slowly, like a rising tide. First, rations dwindle. Families eat half of what they're used to. Then a third. Then they go days without food. Children stop growing. Adults weaken. The streets that once echoed with prayers and commerce now have bodies that no one has the strength to bury. And when someone tries to escape, jumping the walls at night to search for food in the surrounding areas, the Roman soldiers have clear orders. Crucify them within sight of the walls. 500 crosses a day, according to the historian Flavius Josephus, who witnessed the siege. 500 daily messages that there is no escape possible. Within this collapse, the Second Temple remains untouched. Erected by Herod decades earlier, with sun-reflecting white stone blocks and shimmering gold details visible for miles, the temple is not merely a religious building. It is the central bank, the Supreme Court, and the Vatican of Judaism combined into an architectural structure that dominates the urban landscape. Within it, daily sacrifices are performed that, according to tradition, uphold the covenant between God and Israel. Within it lie the treasures accumulated over generations. Within it is decided what is law and what is sin. As long as the temple stands, technically, Jewish civilization still exists. Therefore, when the second wall falls in June and then the third in July, the defenders retreat to the temple complex. They transform the most sacred place into a fortification. And Titus faces a dilemma. Destroying the temple would be a sacrilege that would provoke revolt in all the provinces of the East. But indefinitely besieging a building of that scale, with defenders willing to die, would cost thousands of Roman soldiers. The solution comes in the form of fire. During an assault in early August, a Roman soldier throws a lit torch through a window. The flames reach the roof beams, and in a matter of hours, the building that took decades to construct is transformed into a monumental pyre. At first glance, the destruction of the temple seems like the end of a religion. Without the temple, there are no sacrifices. Without sacrifices, there is no ritual connecting the people to God according to Mosaic law. But in reality, it is the birth of a transformation. Because while the flames consume the temple, a group of rabbis led by Yohanan ben Zakkai is already negotiating with Titus. They ask permission to leave the city and establish a school in Yavne, a coastal city outside the war zone. And there, far from the still smoldering ruins, they begin to rewrite Judaism. Without the temple, the synagogue becomes the center. Without sacrifices, prayer and Torah study become the main ritual. Without a physical Jerusalem, Jerusalem becomes a portable idea that can exist anywhere 10 Jews are gathered. And that is why, in the following centuries, while other peoples conquered by Rome disappear culturally, Judaism survives, dispersed throughout the world. September arrives with the city in ruins. The Romans control everything except one last stronghold, the Antonia fortress, which falls after days of hand-to-hand combat. Titus orders systematic demolition. The walls are torn down, public buildings are burned. What was once the capital of a kingdom becomes rubble and ashes, and the surviving population, perhaps 100,000 people out of the million who were there in May, is divided into 3 categories. Young men go to the arena to die fighting gladiators or wild animals as public entertainment. Women and children are sold as slaves in the Mediterranean markets, and the elderly, too old to be worth anything, are left to starve to death among the ruins. The human cost of the siege was immense. Flavius Josephus records 1,100,000 dead, a number that modern historians consider exaggerated, but which indicates a demographic catastrophe unparalleled at the time. Entire generations of families disappeared. Priestly lineages that traced back to Aaron became extinct. Entire villages in Judea lost all their adult men. And for the first time in Jewish history, the majority of living Jews no longer resided in the land of Israel. They were scattered: Alexandria, Rome, Babylon, Antioch. The diaspora ceased to be a marginal phenomenon and became the norm. But the transformation goes beyond geographical dispersion. Without the temple to centralize authority, Judaism decentralizes. Each community develops its own local traditions. The interpretation of the law, previously monopolized by the priests in Jerusalem, is now open to debate in rabbinical schools. The Talmud, compiled over the following centuries, is a direct record of this decentralization. Thousands of pages of discussions, arguments, counter-arguments, minority opinions, preserved alongside majority ones. It is the opposite of an authoritarian system. It is a religion that has learned to survive without capital, without a temple, without territory. And this pattern repeats itself. When Rome expelled the Jews from Jerusalem completely after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, even forbidding them from approaching the city, Judaism did not disappear. it adapted. When Spain expelled the Jews in 1492, forcing a new diaspora, the communities regrouped in Amsterdam, Istanbul, and North Africa. When the pogroms of Eastern Europe in the 19th century forced mass migrations, synagogues sprang up in New York, Buenos Aires, and Johannesburg. Each catastrophe should have been the end. But what the siege of Jerusalem taught was a lesson in survival without a physical center, a portable culture that exists wherever its practitioners are. The most direct parallel is found in the Arch of Titus, erected in Rome to commemorate the conquest. There, sculpted in marble, is the scene of the sacking of the temple. Roman soldiers carry the seven-branched golden menorah, the silver trumpets, the table of showbread, the physical symbols of Judaism being carried away as trophies. For centuries, Jews in Rome avoided passing under that arch. It was a petrified humiliation. But in 1948, after the founding of the State of Israel, a Jewish crowd deliberately marched through the arch, back in the opposite direction. The message was clear. Rome destroyed the temple, but it did not destroy the people. Today, the Western Wall, the only surviving section of the temple complex, is the holiest site accessible to Jews. Millions visit every year. They place small pieces of paper with prayers in the crevices between the giant stones. And these stones are literally the same blocks that were there when Titus ordered their destruction. They survived because they were the base, the foundation, the part that the Romans considered too laborious to demolish completely. And there is a historical irony in this. What survives is not the grandest part. It is the foundation. The rest was rebuilt in a different form. The siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD lasted 4 months, but its consequences lasted for millennia. What fell that September was not just a city. It was an entire model of how a religion could exist, centralized, territorial, dependent on a specific physical location to function, and what rose from the ashes was something different. A decentralized, portable religion based on texts and interpretations instead of sacrifices and territories. A culture that learned to survive without capital because it had no choice. Jerusalem was rebuilt, destroyed again, rebuilt once more. It changed hands between empires dozens of times. But the Judaism that exists today, whether in Israel or in any synagogue in the world, is a direct descendant of that forced transformation in 70 years after Christ. The diaspora was not an accident. It was the solution to a problem created by the siege. How to maintain an identity without a center, how to preserve a tradition when the place that defines it ceases to exist. The answers to these questions were written among the smoking ruins of the Second Temple, and they still work. If you want to, continue exploring how major historical collapses transformed entire civilizations. Subscribe to the channel. Every week, a new documentary about the events that redefined how humanity organizes itself.